Hello everyone, today we read and comment the fifth chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, its title being Criticism. The text follows. The influence of theoretical principles upon real life is produced more through criticism than through doctrine, for as criticism is an application of abstract truth to real events, therefore it not only brings truth of this description nearer to life, but also accustoms the understanding more to such truths by the constant repetition of their application. We therefore think it to fix the point of view for criticism next to that of theory. From the simple narration of an historical occurrence which places events in chronological order, or at most only touches on their more immediate causes, we separate the critical. In this critical, there are three different operations of the mind may be observed. First, the historical investigation and determining of doubtful facts. This is properly historical research and has nothing in common with theory. Secondly, the tracing of effects to causes. This is the real critical inquiry. It is indispensable to theory, for everything which in theory is to be established, supported, or even merely explained by experience can only be settled in this way. Thirdly, the testing of the means employed. This is criticism, properly speaking, in which praise and censure is contained. This is where theory helps history, or rather the teaching to be derived from it. In these two last strictly critical parts of historical study, all depends on tracing things to their primary elements, that is to say, up to undoubted truths, and not, as is so often done, resting halfway, that is, on some arbitrary assumption or supposition. As respects the tracing of effect to cause, that is often attended with the insuperable difficulty that the real causes are not known. In none of the relations of life does this so frequently happen as in war, where events are seldom fully known, and still less motives, as the latter have been, perhaps purposely, concealed by the chief actor, or have been of such a transient and accidental character that they have been lost for history. For this reason, critical narration must generally proceed hand in hand with historical investigation, and still such a want of connection between cause and effect will often present itself, that it does not seem justifiable to consider effects as the necessary results of known causes. Here, therefore, must occur, that is, historical results which cannot be made use for teaching. All that theory can demand is that the investigation should be rigidly conducted up to that point, and there leave off without drawing conclusions. A real evil springs up only if the known is made perforce to suffice as an explanation of effects, and thus a false importance is ascribed to it. Besides this difficulty, critical inquiry also meets with another great and intrinsic one, which is that the progress of events in war seldom proceeds from one simple cause, but from several in common, and that it therefore is not sufficient to follow up a series of events to their origin in a candid and impartial spirit, but that it is then also necessary to apportion to each contributing cause its due weight. This leads therefore to a closer investigation of their nature, and thus a critical investigation might lead into what is the proper field of theory. The critical consideration, that is, the testing of the means, leads to the question which are the effects peculiar to the means applied, and whether these effects were comprehended in the plans of the person directing. The effects peculiar to the means lead to the investigation of their nature, and thus again into the field of theory. So with this video we start effectively the fifth chapter, so this is the first part, right? We arrived to these chapters that are pretty large and they don't have paragraphs and stuff like that. So we divide it in chunks and then comment them step by step. So theoretically this should be done all in a row, right? And that's what the Vom Kriege actually should be, aside from the internal repetitions, in the sense that everything is connected, right? So, but Von Clausewitz also helps because he goes by steps, so that even in the way he separate these chapters, there is a logic to it, because it's, step by step, concept after concept. So this video is particularly important in my opinion, because it really opens to something we have already seen, right? And then also into that, knowing that, having read this before, about what is effectively the historical method that, in this case, the theory of the art of war, in fact, should employ, meaning that, as we have seen, the theory of the art of war fundamentally derives from military history, right? Because either you got the experience of war, of command, rather, so the experience of what should be done through direct military experience, that is the most important one, but also from history books, because that's how it works for Von Clausewitz. These are the two elements, right? The second especially being complementary to the one in many ways. You need effectively to reason historically, and to consider how you can effectively filter and reason on the evidence that you get. And as you have seen here through the text, that's quite a challenge, because of the particular nature of war that makes everything way more complicated than what it seems. Now, this video is so important, in fact, because if just people who get interested in history in general and have a particular tendency towards military history, warfare, actually read just this page, they could understand so much about what they do and what it should be done in the first place when dealing with warfare, right? And this is valid for every type of warfare, right? Even if you're a fantasy novelist, right, you must realize that something is more or less plausible on the base of a logic that, okay, it's fantasy, maybe this is just an example I chose now, but still there is a realism that you can't take out of the equation when talking about warfare. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about actual history or theory proper, because it all stems from this evidence that comes from actual history in a way or in another. When we're talking about warfare, we're not talking about an ideal thing. We're not abstracting like Jomini did, right? And pretending that that was the deal, right? Abstracting to get closer to theory. How does it work, right? Von Clausewitz does the same exact opposite, right? And creates this theory that is effectively like a method, right? And it shows you how you should start from the evidence that you get, realizing that is limited, that there are certain connections that should be drawn. There is a general judgment that you should be able to, to formulate, but that everything is enormously complicated, and yet there is a sort of an escape route. We will see it, later in the chapter, not today, but already from this read, you understand that so much here is already laid down. So first of all, criticism, right? So the title, as we've read now, is essentially this activity that must go in parallel to theory, right? So theory is a set of notions that works, if you want, dynamically, because it as von Clausewitz showed us, it's fundamentally a flexible set of notions. Like, there's not a theory that describes what happens on the field in every given occasion, right? So you have always, so it's implicit in it that you have always to look at it and to be able to applicate what you can get from it, if you can, right, in a given situation, knowing that it's there, but mostly actually acting upon what you see there and what your mind and heart suggest you, right? And that's the single most important thing. But aside from the battlefield and the moment at which this should be done, you can look at theory. I mean, you can't objectively look at theory simply taking it as a passive thing. First of all, because that's come from somewhere, right? It's been built over time. There is a historical process in how this happened. Secondly, you must effectively understand it, right? You must be capable of being being flexible, as it's been suggested to you through this criticism. So effectively, theory without criticism doesn't make sense. So, and that's why, aside from the positivistic take on war, like you can't win if you play, I don't know, a button rather than another, right, and choose a formation rather than another, simplifying everything to the extremes as if war was easy. Well, war is not easy by definition, and everyone who thinks that there is a simple solution to anything and that can be summed up just in a small thing, doesn't quite have the idea of what it even means, a historical inquiry, under that point of view, because everything actually does get down to simple things at the end when you have to act. But what's behind that, as a general understanding of warfare, is an enormously complicated stuff. It can come from theory, can come from experience that overlap each other, but it also comes from criticism that is part of the same. And it's a very, what is beautiful of this is that there is a margin of subjectivity, as von Clausewitz has showed here, is that you can't pretend to think there is a truth out there that you can reach, right? Truth is out there, incidentally, but you can't reach it. So sometimes, this is von Clausewitz in a nutshell, it's better to follow a certain, autonomy, right? It's much healthier, and we've seen it with doctrine as a method that doesn't quite have to, in which doctrine doesn't have to be received passively, but it's just a way things are done that you must learn, but you don't have to necessarily applicate every time, because doing that you can lead to massive catastrophe. So von Clausewitz writes, the influence of theoretical principles upon real life is produced more through criticism than through doctrine, right? For as criticism is an application of abstract truth to real events, therefore it not only brings truth of this description nearer to life, but also accustoms the understanding more to such truths by the constant repetition of their application. This is very important because it tells you even how theory is effectively built, right? Criticism is not only, the interesting thing of criticism is that it has, that it's formulated through a sort of instinctive thinking, right? The famous coup d'oeil that von Clausewitz talks about, right? There are things that you can understand. Von Clausewitz says, in war, even if you do not have an education, a strictly education in military theory, in a particular doctrine, right? Through experience and through applicating what you sense from that situation over and over again, you can get to a level of refinement that you don't necessarily have to put in written form to understand. This is very interesting because it explains historically how, of course, war has always been fought pretty damn well, even before the existence of any form of theory of doctrine, right? And don't list to me, in fact, those works like, Sun Tzu, please, no. But not even if you read Xenophon or Thucydides, you realize there that there is a criticism going on. It's not theory. It's basically showing you on the basis of some evidence what the war is fundamentally about, and getting that esprit de finesse, as Descartes would have said, that allows you to get, you have already seen this, it's not quite the same, but I get it, right? And this happens, as we have explained also in the previous chapters, in a very instinctive way. Like the human brain is fundamentally apt to this. We do things without thinking, right? And we learn incredibly without thinking. Through a direct experience. So I guess that this can fit pretty well in what von Clausewitz is exemplifying in it. In other words, all the great generals that didn't leave anything written or didn't have a particular military education, were so because they had their own share of military experience. They knew how the whole thing was, and they got what effectively and practically makes a difference on the field, on camping, right? And dealing with the enormous amount of problems, and especially with the effects that this has on your morale, right? That's the single most important thing. Never think war is that there is something more important in war than your moral resources, right? You can have the best guns, you can have all the resources that you want, but if you're not motivated, you don't make a difference. The same goes for doctrine. You can have the best doctrine in the world, but you have also to learn it and learn how to apply that. Well, without criticism, you can't do that, right? And it's I don't know whether what I say sounds sensible, in the sense that objectively it if you've never heard about these things ever, I don't know if you clicked on this video after having listened to all the others, in case you know what I'm talking about, or you click in here for the first time. I can't understand the level of apparent abstraction that here is going on, but it's actually not the case, right? This is probably the single most concrete thing that you can ever hear about war through this text. In this case, it makes you understand how much you can't do anything just by receiving passive information that you do not know how to criticize. That's why before I was saying that this should be read by anyone who, I don't know, maybe quotes a book or a source and says, "Oh, look, I found this, I waive it because it's correct, it comes from history, right? So it must be right." No, that's not how we do history. History is done through, in fact, historical criticism. Now let's see better what we're talking about. And excuse me, I'm reading before if there was something we skipped. Yes, the concept on theoretical principles upon real life, that it's partly what we encompass through this explanation. It is fundamentally the idea that if you, that those principles we were talking about in the previous chapter were formulated, it's not because there was a pre-existing theory, but because someone found them out through through direct military experience. Like the same. That's why I hate modernistic prejudices so much, and I basically quote, every 2 videos, because we think, as modern people, generally speaking, that people evolve because they have manuals. Because someone writes, the theory, and then the practice follows. Historically speaking, it's completely the other way around. Theory is formed only when you already know how to make things work. Right, so do not attribute importance to the doctrine, in fact, as a dogma such. That is always malleable. It changes every single time. There's not a single time in which doctrine fit perfectly the concrete application of your armored forces. It never happened, right? And doctrine evolves continuously. There is a forever going debate on this, and it evolves. Like, just check out, I don't know, there are certain sites, especially about the US military, that maybe one day we'll talk about that. It shows you, for example, year after year, right? What are the new challenges? What are the new problems? How the situation is changing, right? And that's how it takes place. But the great work behind that is not the sheet of paper that comes out of there. It's actually the guy behind that thought of the problem by assessing it through means that nobody probably taught him or her to to learn, right? But experience. And this is very interesting because it's also how many people wonder how to get military logic from, right? Where to get military logic from, or to grow experience in these topics. there is no proper, there is a proper way. It is always naturally to pick the sources, study battles and campaigns, not through Wikipedia, not even through books, but through the actual sources, and all of them together, and repeat over and over again, right, for all of your life. That's the best and only way, right? Then you can integrate this with the Vom Kriege, with other studies, but the concept here is that until you do not get that experience of the complexity of war, you can't effectively develop any criticism, properly meant. And von Clausewitz then going on writes, we therefore think it necessary to fix the point of view for criticism next to that of theory, right? So that they go in parallel, actually. And then he goes on and says, from the simple narration of an historical occurrence which places events in chronological order, or at most only touches on their more immediate causes, we separate the critical, right? The critical here would be the critical narrative, essentially, right? So not a simple story, but effectively a deep, insightful, criticism in the matters of war, in every given military history, that does not just look at the evidence, but also sorts this evidence out and comes up with an answer that is also judgmental about what could be done at that. But the problem is that this is not easy at all, right? And that this is the problem of every single historian, not just the military one. It's really about not having any certainty whatsoever, right? The beauty of history is that it's built effectively on nothing, right? There is no valid evidence effectively for anything, historically speaking. You can't say that you even exist. How can you know what happened in a place where you didn't even see what happened? Even if you did, you wouldn't understand that. So that's how limited we are in every scientific field or our understanding, right? And the rest it doesn't matter, right? And that's why this work also gives so much confidence, because it shows you that after all, something good you can make about reality is possible. It's as if you were gravitating around the truth, right? The problem is spotting where this truth is, generally speaking. Maybe you will not see it, you will not get it, but you will somewhat get closer to it. And then he says he says from the simple narration of historical occurrence which places events in chronological order, or at most only touches on their more immediate causes, we separate the critical, which means that naturally there is a first assessment of what the evidence is, right? More or less orderly put, right? There is a matter of method in that too, right? Getting evidence sometimes is also challenging, right? It's not easy to simply start saying, okay, I decided which evidence is. No, you should be seriously cautious about doing that, right? Because it's also what effectively happens. Like every historical inquiry starts with a deliberate choice of leaving something out. There is no historical inquiry that takes into consideration everything, because what you would need would be effectively infinitely researchable. Let's put it in this way. Not necessarily infinitely large, but just you would have problems even to define what an evidence is, right? But the critical narrative is another story. It's the next step. It's when you have all what you decided to put on the table and you start to think through that. And that's basically the single most important moment in history, because as I often say, you can't read even all of your life, but if you simply presume that what you read is what you get passively from someone that knows it better than you, and without you actually, which is impossible, but by a certain degree it happens, without you actually having to do anything about it, simply getting the best in knowing it, well, that's not quite a good start, right? It's not going to change much in your life, probably, right? Unless you have of course, that may trigger, in fact, you getting more critical and more in depth with the matter, wanted to know more. But there is always a sort of boundary in which you say, okay, I have to trust someone in order to know things by a certain degree. We can't be competent about anything, about everything, and especially not even in our alleged subject in which we specialize, right? Do you think that historians actually are reliable about all history or what is contained in history? I mean, it's a crazy thought. Nobody even gets close to a minimal part of such a thing, right? The same is valid basically for every person, right? Because we, especially in history, it's as if you had more to create your own field than actually visiting the one of others. But this also depends on. This is the way I like to look at history. Frankly, I'm not very interested in what other people wrote, if not as a starting point for me, and not as the critical moment proper. Is knowing what those people already know so that I can do something about it, right? There are people instead who are much more feel at ease as essentially following someone's track and doing things that they're told to do, or that someone else has already explored because they have that admiration maybe towards a certain scholar. I can't feel that, right? I'm a person. If you're I don't think you're interested to know in the sense of me personally, but I can tell you, since I'm talking here about a lot of things that deal with this problem, that I personally never had anyone I wanted to be. Like, I've never had like a hero, I liked a lot of people, of course, and I was, anxious of, learning from them and so on, but I never, felt these people as, now I have to live my life in the wake of this thinking, right? And this goes also for ideology. I don't care. Like, I think it's boring. I'm a terribly nihilist by certain standard. I do believe that most of what we do is worthless because we're doomed anyway, but still there are certain achievements that can help society as a whole that are of better quality, at least in my opinion, if they start from an independent thinking in the truest sense of the world, right? The word, and that's important for this critical attitude, right? And creating a critical narrative. We should always be critical, right? In even a positive or negative sense. I mean, we should be able to realize that everything we learn is debatable. I mean, even what seems to be, for political, social reasons that need, to be followed, right, for necessity, which we should do in part. But at the same time, we can't think as if that is actual truth, because we can't get to that. And we know that, even scientifically speaking, it doesn't happen. Right, so this is a thinking that doesn't... most people legitimately are in the situation, in my opinion, that they just should obey in some part, should follow the trail in some way, because that's politically and socially more functional after all. But who disposes of these trails and address and orients them should know that everything is debatable. There is not a single damn thing in this world that is not debatable, that is untrue by a certain margin. Right? This is the attitude you must have towards literally everything everyone right? Because if you don't do that, you will create more problems in the first place. So let's delete this myth that scholars are important people, right? That there is the ultimate authority. There are people who have studied more certain things that you can measure how much they know, and they do know that, and you can assess that they know it. But this doesn't mean they are actually right in the first place about what they are talking about. They could be wrong. They might have misinterpreted certain things, so that maybe that amount of knowledge would be better explainable, right? Even if the core is good, right? So I'm not saying everything, but the beauty of history is that you can create as many perspectives as you want in this regard, that it's very difficult to effectively exhaust a topic. And there is always room for other comparisons of sort. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, in this critical, 3 different operations of the mind may be observed. So the critical consists of these 3 activities. So the first one is the historical investigation and determining of doubtful facts. Right? This is probably historical research and has nothing in common with theory. So this is fundamentally the moment in which in a research you not just collected the sources, like, because at this point you should have already done it on a certain criterion that here is not explained, because that's basically that happens in the measure in which you deem it, which your motivations oriented you, like as we were saying before, every historical inquiry starts from an approximation. There is no historical inquiry that is complete, right? So, but then comes the moment in which you have the evidence in front of you. Now, the important though is that you already know that part of it, possibly even the majority, is actually not necessarily false, right? But at least doubtful. That is, you can't determine that. And even in here, you have to be able to say, okay, I feel that this evidence may not actually be valuable for some reason, and that this depends also on what are you inquiring. Fundamentally, there may be beautiful witnesses that you appreciate for other reasons, because they're well written, because they're insightful, they're intelligent, but they may not actually help to answer your question, right? So here, von Clausewitz is really talking about what is, accessible, is confirmable, is how precisely you can confirm a certain the reliability, at least, of a certain evidence, right? And he calls this is the properly historical research, and has nothing in common with theory. But that's an important step as well, because in there you also determine what you're going to think on as a base that is not a few, right? Because you already in some ways being critical, right? Because you don't fully know here what is certain either, right? Here von Clausewitz now eventually will specify better what is really meaning, because here he is dealing with the matter as if you could effectively distinguish what is dubious from what is certain, but it's never the case, right? And he recognizes it too as well. But still, it's what you should be able to do. Right? Let's assume there is a falsification, or at least something is invented, made up for some reason. This is the moment in which you should find out and to give credit to your source. Second step, the tracing of effects to causes. Now this is very tough. Because the concept is very simple, but it's probably the hardest thing to do, right? This is the real critical inquiry, von Clausewitz writes. It is indispensable to theory, for everything which in theory is to be established, supported, or even merely explained by experience can only be settled in this way, right? So, literally, tracing of effects to causes. Now, this is probably one of the single most difficult things you can ever done, right? Because here we're not just talking about the reliability of the evidence. This is actually tracing a link, a connection between things that you read about and that nobody explicitates most of the times for you what the connection is. This is something that I'm currently doing every day for my work, and I can tell you it's most of the times you have not really to completely give up, because you have to follow your your theory, in fact. And that's the interesting thing here, is that you deliberately choose to draw a connection between a link between effect and cause, right? It's not something you can effectively assess most of the times, because if a source tells you one thing, I mean, the source is explicitly saying, this happened because of this, fine, but is that reliable? Is that true? And mind that it happens very often that, in fact, these links are not true, or at least they're not correct, or at least they're not the most important aspect of the story. You should understand why that author, for example, wrote a certain thing, right? If you're lucky, in fact, to have an author that explicitates for you such link, because in other fields you don't even have that. And this, in fact, Clausewitz rightly stresses the fact that this is the real critical inquiry, right? This is the moment in which you effectively, it's as if you crossed one border, right, between what is in potential and what is in action. It's for your research, right? Because before the real critical inquiry, you have a load of information that is there, that you probably have skipped through it. You know what it's about. You know that there is some juicy stuff, right? You know what you want to get to it. You're anxious. Then you get to the real critical inquiry, and you start to understand many things you didn't realize before. Like, you can read, that's why before I said you can read lots of stuff, right? But before you make a really a critical thinking of it, you don't realize certain things. And this naturally, this usually passes through studying, what we call studying proper, so that there is a massive difference between reading stuff and studying stuff, right? And in order to study things, you should essentially get to the root of it. Like, this is all taken in consideration, that you're taking all you need, really, to all, as much as you can, to substantiate this inquiry, right? Not just a few things, right? So that's why also the initial moment is so important, because you have to determine how much evidence you're going to use, which is a huge problem for historical research, right? But this is the moment in which what you have, stocked before the inquiry for the research passes through a magic filter that makes you see the stuff in a wholly different way, and that, as von Clausewitz rightly says, it is indispensable to theory. Here we're talking specifically about the theory of the art of war, right? As any other historical theory, but remember that this is stuff that eventually goes to back a doctrine eventually, right? So something that should help you to understand how armies worked in a certain time. I'm very, very fascinated by this, because I believe it's what every military historian does, and that's what I'm doing, right? I can make you an example in this regard. I made you also other times. There's a part of my work which I studied 11 battles in which that I knew before, right? That I had read about, that I got an impression of, etc. And I collected all the studies, all the sources. Then I studied the stuff, right? I analyzed source by source, looked at the criticism of them, and etc. And first of all, I got a completely different view, and especially a much enormous depth on this military events through the inquiry, right? But secondly, I also got now, but this is maybe belongs to the third passage more, and we'll see, we will read now, let's say a comparative view of all of these events that helped me specifically for these battles to say that, look, here there is a pattern. Like, it's not just that these battles share similarities about banal things that can be found in any battle, but for example, and that's what I studied more because I care about tactics chiefly in this work, and I found out there was a common formation that was employed in these battles, more or less, and that it was compatible with all of them, that in many ways it didn't it was showing homogeneity that before reading this, before carrying out the inquiry, I hadn't understood. Right, I had read the same sources. Right, I can't say that I didn't read them carefully, but I simply hadn't tried to sort out the extended meaning of that stuff, the deep meaning of that stuff, and compare them with other stuff I had learned. Now that is an inquiry, and it takes an awful lot of resources. And by the way, it's also very easy to be carried away by the enthusiasm, saying, oh look, I found this, and especially trying to square the circle, right? And yet you have to stay cold, because you must be fair with this. Like, you don't have to enforce a narrative. This is also a big problem of all inquiries. Like, what the hell are you trying to do, right? I think the healthiest approach in any analysis is to start from zero, like having your own opinion, but leaving them aside from a moment, being fully honest with yourself and saying, okay, what I have to find out here is, first of all, what happens, not what I wish it to be, right? Which is the beauty of actually of the scientific method in itself. I mean, this should be a free and pure intention of simply finding out with a full intellectual honesty what the hell is happening. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen all the time. Not even in science this happens, right? There are a lot of people who research stuff because they have interest behind that, of economical, ideological, whatever thing it is, academical, because it happens. Some of the most ferocious struggles go on, you think, in history. Well, actually they go on in places like physics, right, where you would think that there is not much to discuss in front of evidence. Instead there is, and exactly because it is the case. In fact, I must say, in history we're fairly moderate people when we deal with. There are ferocious struggles as well, but usually they stem from, it's kind of silly because there is so much to know and so much room, especially for certain topics, that, what's the point of conflicting with someone else? We stay all distance in a certain sense, like with coronavirus, and with nobody bothers anyone. But unfortunately it does happen, and unfortunately also it always happens, in the sense that I don't know any historian of any sort that basically starts from an unbiased perspective. And you know what? There wouldn't be history if that was the case. Because we start to study history because we're interested about something specifically. So even the curiosity that makes it start effectively begins from our imperfection, from our faults, from our prejudices, from our opinions of every kind, not necessarily even negative, but still in a way that can definitely influence, in a unfair way, in a subjective way, let's say, the inquiry in itself. But it's very fascinating that von Clausewitz gets it down so simply to one thing that seems almost mathematical, that is tracing of effects to causes. Right? And when you read this for the first time, you say, oh my god, von Clausewitz got crazy. How can you do that? You just said that we can't know basically anything, what the hell is going on. Well, as we've seen as well, he explains pretty well that this is the ideal picture. You wish you could so simply trace effects to causes, right? But most of the times it's always impossible in a perfectly scientific way. It doesn't happen. There is no way out. I'm reading here, for everything which in theory is to be established, supported, or even merely explained by experience can only be settled in this way. Yes, this is very important for the theory of the art of war. That is that the real critical inquiry, how we have described it, is effectively the matter of the greater matter of debate in the critical phase, right? That theory is subjected to, because effectively this is the evidence that you are using to sustain the theory, right? It's not merely the evidence that you got from scratch, right, as a passive object. Now, you basically built up a theory that is sustained by some interaction between the sources, between the evidence, let's say better, and that it's as if it was a magnetic field that separates the evidence from the theory, right? And you don't quite know what is happening in between. And it's destined to remain that foggy most of the times and debatable, right? But at the same time, this is very useful, as we all know, because the debate generates other, suggestions and hypotheses, and in this sense, it expands all the possible, realities that can be behind an evidence, right? And this is very important for historical inquiry itself. And von Clausewitz talks about the third step, is the testing of the means employed, right? This is criticism, properly speaking, he writes, in which praise and censure is contained. This is where theory helps history, or rather the teaching, to be derived from it, right? This is very important, and this is in a way where the bitterest fight is going on, right? Because there is not just the the cold process of saying, okay, let's trace cause to effect, mathematically, coldly, without any. No, there is a judgment, there is a human taste to it that is expressed, and that tendentially is biased, right? It's more openly biased, like it allows to formulate other hypotheses. That is, for example, when I figured out that a certain formation was effectively employed in those battles, but not in all of them, for example, I said, what do we have to think about this? Like, was this formation used standardly, orientatively at all times, or was it, in certain armies and in others not? Why did the sources maybe didn't explicitate in other moments, and do we have to take that as an evidence of absence? Usually not. This is also very important, right? Because as I often said in my videos, it seems to me at least that there is a tendency in the academic world, in generally in all subjects, not specifically more scientific or humanistic ones, but the one, especially maybe in the humanistic ones more, and this is even more fascinating because it shows you that, we historians maybe are somewhat more mannered, but at the same time we are kind of darker and less, to be trusted for real. And that's the impression I have, that we have this idea that we're dealing with difficult stuff, but we also like to say, I have my own theory, and that's special, you can't touch it, right? Because I researched through all that pile of paper, right? And you did not. And that's where also ego gets involved, because there can be a lot of these problems in the subject matter, because it does happen effectively that, especially when we do not know so much about a certain world, and this is in fact in my opinion happens before, for those historical times or those subjects that have fewer evidence, usually, where therefore more people are also called to debate with others, that paradoxically, because since there is less evidence, you also kind of know less in general what the hell it was, right? So there were more options, and that's where it gets more ideological. Like if you take fields, for example, as anthropology, right? For example, primitive warfare. Like primitive warfare, you would think it's something studied by people who look more or less like, I don't know, medievalist. Could be. No, it's not like that. There is a ferocious ideological aggression forever going on in these fields, because when you lack evidence, there is more room for fantasy in some way, imagination, let's say better, and then proportionally much room for people to criticize you, right? So that's not easy, and very often the poor evidence that exists is cries alone, because people don't even take that into consideration anymore. They prefer to conflict mostly about their own theory, right? But I find very interesting that von Clausewitz here is highlighting this aspect, that he includes in the critical narrative legitimately this third stage, in which effectively you must express a kind of a subjective judgment, right? Of praise or censor, here he says. That is to say, this is garbage or this is great, right? And that can hurt, right? And I don't know here what von Clausewitz is. I mean, I think he's aware about the necessity of the debate, right? And he's also aware that, as we've seen also in his method, that he said how when you effectively don't know what the reality is, like in a war situation, it's better that you follow your initial decisions, right? If there is not overwhelming evidence that shows you that things are going otherwise, you better methodically follow your own plan than losing time and energies and resources to modify it once you have already started. This is strikingly close, in fact, also to what historical inquiry really is. Right, it's very important to get things well first, because those are the things that effectively are going to influence your work the most, and chances are you can get at the end and saying, okay, well, maybe I got this all wrong, right, and trying to conceal it at that point because you can't come back, right, and that's the real problem, right, that also happens. I must say I had it in part because I realized that everything is approximate. We also have to be very careful what you're doing, and not to indulge into your own pretending, I don't know, that something is as you want because it fits your purposes, you think it makes your work easier, right? You have to be realistic about that as well. But at the same time, once you have taken a path, I mean, it's not a great idea to reverse, to go multiple, to turn another way to see how it was. You should be stay flexible. It's also fair to have a flexible system. There is an art even in that. But at the same time, you should be consistent with what you're doing, and that depends also much on what you're committed to. Like, if you truly believe you can discover something, and I personally, when I started this work, for example, I didn't. Like, I was pretty. I knew what the historical problem was, and I knew more or less what I could find out, but I had no idea of, I had no thesis to demonstrate proper. Like, I posed myself in this condition and say, let's see simply what I find, and then let's talk about it, let's reflect on it. And that's a healthy attitude as well, but there are people who also know pretty well what they're going towards, and therefore are normally more committed, right? This is also a part of growing, because nobody effectively teaches you what's that about. Like, this is some discussion we should have in this world, where it seems to me that we're losing the plot on so many levels, right? That we stick to dogmatically to doctrine. Like, you should do this, it's mostly bureaucratic, step after step, but nobody tells you how certain things must be done. And of course you can't find out until you do it yourself, but at least there can be some sort of theory of notion that tells you, look, in this stage you should concentrate on this aspect of your research, and then going on. So, with Schwerpunkt, maybe we will do it at one point more, a bit of a method of history, like, and how you should start with the right foot, fundamentally, rather than, repenting afterwards, right? So, this is what effectively also the Clausewitzian theory is presenting you with. It's not much what effectively you will have to do, because the research is yours, right? The battle is yours, the campaign, the war is yours. What we're telling you is that, look, we were in your situation, and of course it was a different situation, but it was still war, and war does respond to certain dynamics, and therefore you have to take in consideration those dynamics. So this is the relevance of von Clausewitz, and it's not to be dismissed, because this thing works. This thing does have a practical utility. And most of the von Clausewitz critics, telling the truth, do not even get so far with the criticism of the theory. Some of them just didn't express these delusions, like trying to spot in von Clausewitz some sort of ideologism about certain political orientation. There is literally nothing of the slightest of anything in this work. We're reading it step by step. This is not colored in any possible way. It's a method, right? If you don't get it when you read it, it means you haven't gotten anything about it. But yeah, and von Clausewitz justifies this third step. First of all, he addresses the fact that these notions, the outcome of the inquiry, should be tested, right? And normally in an inquiry, so in the strictly historical moment, this tests itself, right? I don't think here von Clausewitz is talking about testing on the field proper, right? This also happens in some way, but it's actually does happen also potently in some situations, right? But it's never quite tied to a pre-existing scenario that you can say, okay, let's now reproduce in laboratory what a battle can be by fighting one, right? That is not how wars are fought normally. This is really about the fact that you should test the validity of the means employed. That is, you should somewhat perfection the in fact the instruments you used up to that point at every level to obtain that result. This can be atrocious because it really criticizes the same method you employ, the same criterion you employ. But at the same time, it can also highlight, in fact, the quality of your work. That is, you, as we were saying at the beginning, we can't know everything, right, when we make a historical inquiry. So we're always subject to, first of all, we all approximate, but also because of this, exactly, we're subject to potential criticism, right? But von Clausewitz's simplicity is the key here, that things that when you have to create a theory, it doesn't have to be overly complicated, because as he has showed us, the theory is overly complicated at one point fails, right? Because you can't put your mind, wrap your mind around it, in the moments in which you actually need it, right? This is valid for history as well, if you let's I don't know, I hope that I will manage to finish this work. At that point it will be examined, and I already know what can be said about that, like about the method, what kind of sources you used, etc. But at the same time, it's the outcome that also matters. Like, if in order to demonstrate something, I used effectively the means that show you that something exists, and I use the term exist, but let's say that theory is valid, let's put it better. Well, and that theory actually tells you something striking. Well, at that point you can't really say, okay, well, but maybe the method doesn't work well, because that person has demonstrated you in a way or another that effectively was a good method at that point, that there is such a thing going on, right? And sometimes it can even be a small achievement, right? I knew many of my PhD colleagues that, for example, they spend we do spend years doing this, right? But after all, we add maybe just a tiny bit more to what we already know, right? Remember, one of my PhD colleagues that left, finished, what was it, last year? I remember her, his tutor saying to him, like, yeah, I think after all, there is a terrific lady, a character that I will have to describe. I think that after all, what you says, adds something about that specific topic that he had investigated, right? And that's enough sometimes to. It's not in fact the quantity, or not even the quality in itself that matters, but it's also the effect, sometimes the trigger that it can constitute for other people to start wondering, like, look, this person made that step forward, so that is feasible, right? It gives you confidence, it gives you the idea that we should maybe rethink a certain topic, that there is something we thought it was in a way, and that it turns out it's not quite that way, right? So it's sometimes very difficult. Then I don't know. Every person then eventually has a method on its own. Like, this criticism is somewhat universal in its. The one from Clausewitz outlined here is universal in the sense that effectively all these passages are, done. Are made every time, right? There is always, even if they're mixed in some ways, maybe you're a particularly messy person, you integrate sources at the end of the, but these activities happen all the time. There's always a collection, a discrimination of the reliability of the evidence. There is always a critical inquiry of the evidence, and there is always a sort of testing of whether this theory stands on its feet, right? So in whichever way you make it, this is always working this way. The problem is that the subject can be different, the context can be different, the method in itself is different. Also, the amount of everything varies, right? And this is what Von Clausewitz is showing us, that yes, there is a reality that changes in the most unimaginable way. At the same time, there's still a way to deal with this that is a method, right? So it's not an essence. It's not something you can materially grasp, right? But it's a way you can deal with it in order to understand something more, and more effectively and more efficiently, right? Then von Clausewitz comments a bit, especially, he says, in these two last strictly critical parts, so the second and the third step of historical study, all depends on tracing things to their primary elements, that is to say, up to undoubted truths, and not, as is often done, resting halfway, that is, on some arbitrary assumption or supposition. Yes, ideally. In fact, he writes, I respect the tracing of effect to cause that is often attended with the insuperable difficulty that the real causes are not known. Guess what? Like, that if you're trying to do the first step, and you find out that you actually don't know what a certain thing happens, what do you do? Like, you should stop. You shouldn't basically talk about anything because you don't know the causes, right? It can't be done. Von Clausewitz writes, in none of the relations of life does this so frequently happen as in war, where events are seldom fully known, and still less motives, as the latter have been perhaps purposely concealed by the chief actor, or have been of such transient and accidental character that they have been lost for in history. Now, this makes you realize, especially in war, how complicated the thing is. As, of course, first of all, how do you record what happens in war? Like, you can record the most important things, right? You know where that division has fought, and more or less how much men was there, was the entity of the enemy. Yeah, you can study like that. But at the same time, when it comes to the intention of the commanders, for example, how can you quantify that? How can you record that? Let's assume that commander gets blown up by a mortar shell. Wait, what the hell do you do? Like, you can guess, but at the same time, you don't know what the impressions of this person was. What some write these things, but some even conceal what happens on purpose, because maybe they realize they have screwed up, or they've done something even worse. And this is like history in a nutshell. This is always the case. Think about fake news, right? Fake news are interesting because today we can, especially the war in Syria was more, was hotter, like, and you could follow all these, but also in the Ukraine or wherever was a conflict, a war going on. You could check today. You can check. This is a beautiful thing. Most of the sources online, there are entire communities. I've never been part of them, but it was extremely fascinating. For example, in the Ukraine, to look at all the various of the photos, basically, of the Russian tanks that were there, and through the the numbers, the badges, the other characteristics, and basically there's people who collected an enormous amount of photos all through the internet. I mean, sitting at home and finding out exactly how many of those tanks were there, where they had fought, when they had been knocked out, things like those, for example. And that is very interesting because there is a kind of harder evidence that eventually remains, for example, in those forums, because most people don't even know that they exist. And maybe, I don't know how journalists or wherever, the sources of the major media are in this regard, which, television normally takes it straight from, sites that are, they don't tell you straight what the source is, right? But you can trace it today, usually. And it's very fascinating to see, even in those cases, of course, that we don't know what the hell is going on. Remember when, the chemical weapons used in Syria recently said, the Americans shot it, the Russians shot it, right? This is not a place to discuss who did what. But the point is that it's that easy to actually claim that something and its exact opposite when effectively the evidence stops. A word, a misinterpretation, a forced, interpretation, yes, again, or someone would believe someone else, right? That is enough to change the whole theory from the base, literally, right? That is a hell of a problem. How do we work with this? And we're objectively not prepared. The internet now, all the problem of fake news is becoming really a real problem, because it's fake news is not just a matter of saying, okay, you create chaos for something. There is a particularly political intent to that. You can offend a country. You can actually make a pretty heavy damage to a country simply by clicking and typing. And that's so easy. And there is all a problem of information, freedom of information, how we deal with this, how do we check this. It's posing enormous problems that, however, are at least at this point, under this specific point of view, are already not regulated. Like, we don't exactly know what to do with that, and we seem to be extremely slow at taking measures in that regard, but also at developing a capacity of autonomous criticism. It seems, incidentally, we're getting ever more polarized, which is definitely not good, because it's exactly the different direction we should take, right? But this is nothing that is being invented now, right? This is also very important to stress, and that's what Von Clausewitz here is showing you, that effectively what he says is applicable to every single thing that is happening nowadays as well. Those people who think that Von Clausewitz is talking about 19th century warfare and nothing else, that is biased, they don't know what this work is. Objectively, they have not read it. It's simple as that. They have not read it, literally. Not even studied or understood it. They haven't read it, opened it, read the pages. But also, the fascinating thing here is to realize in historical perspective that these, for example, these information problems have always been there. Right? We think this is a new thing to misinform, to create fake news. This has always been done. It's just the means that are different. But the essence of this is exactly the same that has always existed and will always exist, interestingly enough. So we have at least this advantage that even if the world changes, we know in this case that this will be the case. I mean, this will happen again and again. So that's where also doctrine should be, fueled by, right? There are big problems in the history of, and it all works also in the way von Clausewitz describes, let's say, essentially the laziness of human mind, right? When you're under greater pressure, you give your best in many ways. When everything is fine, you relax, right? And that's why relaxed moments are very, very, very dangerous, because that's where normally you can be hit by the toughest blow, and that's not, that's risky, and that's a bit like, think about coronavirus. That's another example. We'll talk about war, right? We could make a video about knowing what, what we call this a war, of course, metaphorically, but there are certain things that are similar in this regard. Is that we knew it would happen. That's a fascinating thing. We had predicted it. We had predicted everything. Where it would have happened when, we predicted how this thing would effectively spread. We knew everything, but nobody did anything. That's the point. Politically, socially, we didn't give a damn about it. As many other things. And society works in this regard. I mean, we have been told this myth that everything goes better, right? And we improve, that there is something called progress, right? We don't understand that the more we, in fact, progress, and the more the thing gets risky, by far, right? A society of hunter-gatherers is much more resistant to any kind of possible natural disaster that our society is. That is terrifying if you think about it. Because really, we could easily be hit by an asteroid. Like, up to 20 years, we had a completely view, for example, of this eventuality. And we found an enormous amount of danger we didn't know was there, that we had simply underestimated. Why? Because theoretically, we had not thought it, that it was an intellectual mistake. That's what von Clausewitz says too. I mean, that aside from the moral forces that you can have at a given moment of the war, but the single most important thing is how you think through things, right? That is, how you sort the thing out. That is, reason always wins over the bestiality, right? And that war gets close to an intellectual clash, after all, right? Especially the more society is advanced, that is also very meaningful, because it means we should educate ourselves way more than we have presumed to do now. It seems to me that, I think we are generally more educated than in the past, but not in a qualitative sense, right? We know more things, but it seems critical skill, this critical narrative von Clausewitz is talking about, isn't there. We relaxed, we became very, soft. So I think this is particularly important. It was trying to get where we had stopped here in the text. There's a part of tracing effect of the cause. Yes, because von Clausewitz says, for this reason, critical narration must generally proceed hand in hand with historical investigation, and still such a want of connection between cause and effect will often present itself that it does not seem justifiable to consider effects as necessary results of known causes. So, in other words, what he's suggesting here is that not only you should always test, keep, essentially analyzing whether your theory holds, but also continuously making research on practically other stuff as well, right? You can't think that this connection between cause and effect is just an individual connection, right? This is very interesting when you start, in many ways, you start studying certain aspects. I remember when I got interested in military history I remember it was very little when I could trace this back, but let's say when I got on books and more consistently and began this, I also I was very primitive in the way I did things. Like and this is very common, I think, for many people at the beginning of this. That doesn't necessarily stop as a beginning; it can remain a permanent stage. You tend to make a quantitative accumulation of information. You don't think that behind that information there is in fact a critical knowledge that you can get from them, right? You tend to think that it's a set of tiny little theorems, if you want, that you can't compare, that your mind will grow upon, and in fact it happens. So that this is very fascinating, because I was reading that the more people are intelligent, seemingly, especially or educated, actually, I don't remember, aside from the fact that we do show that the more people are educated, the more they are intelligent. Like the myth that you're born intelligent or you develop intelligently without education is a myth. Like, more intelligent people are more educated people. There is no scientific equivocal about this. But also that this category of people is also more biased. You would think that the simpleton is more biased. No, the simpleton, like, you can see it in history many times, that more primitive cultures actually have a much greater openness to, in fact, they have a much less cultural resistance after all. Is that the big elephantine cultures and civilizations that have an enormous difficulty to modify themselves because they're so big, bulky, and encumbered that they can't modify themselves simply, right? That's why, for example, modernizing a third world country is dramatically easier than it is to make even a tiny improvement in a highly developed country, because you can build everything from scratch, right? And it's pretty simple after all, right? It's really dealing with a simpler system than a more complex one, and obviously in the more complex one, problems increase exponentially, and this is how the historical inquiry really is that and that's where things also get a bit complicated also to explain, because still, if you know a few, you have to make a long way before you can make an actual quantitative progress, right? So that it can be easier to teach someone things from scratch, but it's more difficult also over time to contain this mind on a straight direction. What does this mean exactly? Is that there are lots of people, for example, that study political, military affairs, for example, that they're maybe also well educated and they're also intelligent people, but they get easily ideologized towards a path, because they effectively, I don't know how their mind works, because I don't know, I'm sure it happens to me in many ways as well, but the point is, when you can spot the mistake they make, you also wonder, why does that person choose to take this path after all? Like, why is person, for example, is so dogmatic and doesn't stay more open? And by personal experience, I must say that all the people that I know that have a military historical education seem to be like the more rational and less dogmatic people I've ever met. I mean, this literally has nothing to do with the way they know military history. This has to do with the way they live, like the which they deal with, I don't know, their families, with money, with a lot of things, with dealing with other people as well, right? And This is not to say that you must study military history in order to, to make the right investments or having the right family history, let's say. But the point I'm making here is that as if war was such a complicated subject that it somewhat obliges you to be more serious and more fair and more honest with yourself than other disciplines that just pretend you to teach you that notion, that structure, and letting you take it just the way it is, so that you can replicate it with someone else, and not really doing an autonomous thinking on it. This happens dramatically often, and the fascinating thing is that it happens even when these people have under their eyes, in fact, that same evidence that allows other people to get to the point, because they don't see it. It's a matter of intelligence, really. It's not a matter of just exposure to information. It's what we were telling at the beginning, right? That you can read even for all your life. This is not going to predict exactly whether you will develop as a solidly intellectually critical person, or you are simply remaining there enjoying the book just like doing as a break, right? This is interesting to me, very interesting. It's something that I found striking, that I was already interested in, and I find strikingly explained in von Clausewitz as well. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, here therefore must occur, that is, historical results which cannot be made use of for teaching. Right? All that theory can demand is that the investigation should be rigidly conducted up to that point and there leave off without drawing conclusions. A real evil springs up only if the known is made perforce to suffice as an explanation of effects, and thus a false importance is ascribed to it. So here von Clausewitz admonishes us on one aspect, that as complicated the historical research can be, still it must get to fairly simple conclusions, right? You can't think that theory can be based on an extremely complicated articulated structure, so that it would be useless, right? But at the same time, what he says is that you must stop fundamentally when you realize that you can't get more than much from following that path, and when you effectively realize that you can't go beyond, because effectively you lack the evidence, right? You can maybe even have a good theory, but not being able to demonstrate it, there you have to stop. Also, however, you don't have to be so eager to cross out all what is just an hypothesis, and simply saying, okay, well, let's stick to the only seemingly certain thing that I know, right? And because that can cause another problem, that is actually making theory sterile with just connecting the factors of a certain the cause of a certain event just to a tiny cause, right? It's an example of finding, in fact, we were making before, one source essentially telling you drawing one cause effect, and then, okay, I take this because the source told me, right? So it's somewhat a harder proof than an hypothesis. Well, not quite, right? Theory and hypothesis in part do overlap, right? Because there is always a middle ground of uncertainty in this all. There's no theory that becomes like a law in history, especially, right? So everything is subject to criticism and to a degree of modification. But important there is how much that fits, however, the evidence you find, right? What is important effectively in a theory? How do we proceed, even scientifically speaking? If we have no evidence of anything whatsoever, we can't even make an hypothesis, but it remains there. Then the theories instead is something you literally draw on certain points that by themselves can be criticized, but at least are, backed by some evidence, right? That you must investigate once again. So the process never ends. That's why, fortunately, historical inquiry will never stop. All right, we are getting at a moment in history which we also have to wonder whether we will be able to explain in the first place. I mean, certain periods, for example, with a general theory. What about, for example, the history of the 20th century? Like, now we have a fair idea of what, I don't know, more or less even the 19th century can be taught like, and that's also quite debatable, as everything is. But what about the 20th century? I mean, do we have a general narrative, a critical narrative of the 20th century, what it is, like, if we had to teach it to someone? Objectively, I think, historiographically speaking, we don't. We don't have the amount of we don't have the instruments to cope with such a gigantic system that would be the sort. Nobody, you can't have a single individual that can be expert even just of a tiny bit of the 20th century. It's impossible. And this is also a problem, because in a way or another we will have to find a sort of an answer. But this is valid for even more complicated things like running the world, and we still run the world, right? And the reason is not that we know it particularly well individually, it's that more or less we adjust, and that's why things are becoming also more dangerous, however, as we were saying before, because we presume that the world is easy to run, right? And there are certain essentials that you especially bump into in moments of crisis, so that you say, this was the important thing I missed, right? But that's a first step, right? And that also proves, by the way, that what we call progress, actually, most of the times, is the product of a failure, right? And in philosophy of science, this is how we deal now with innovation, with the idea that there is not a propositive ideal, like, now we think about all the possible things mankind can do. Like, this is something we believed also, I don't know, in times that we knew headed towards pretty dark place. Like, from positivism of the mid-19th century, we went into the World War I, right? So there is not such a, I mean, that's a simplistic explanation, but you get what I'm saying there. That there was a general confidence that everything would be easier and quicker, and it turned out it wouldn't. Like, and that there was a disaster, a massive disaster of different levels, not just World War I. But I think we should actually scare people more than delude themselves. I mean, with these wishful thinking that we can get everything, we will go everywhere. It's like, well, I don't want to speak about the such things, because I don't want to sound like a jerk or to demoralize you. But I mean, let's be real about the world we live in. Let's not pretend there is always a happy ending. Let's not pretend we'll always make it. There is such a huge room for improvement. Like, there were times in which we fairly, we could say that maybe everything was over, and yet we found out other stuff, and we rocketed to. But it seems to me that, at least in our current conditions, I mean, just a few decades ago, we thought at this time we would be eating pills in space stations and going to school on the moon, and coming back. Turns out that it was a bit crazy, right? Obviously, nobody truly believed that. Just, disturbed people could pretend that was possible. But there was a general, and that's the dangerous thing, there was a general positivity towards the idea that such things would happen so quickly. But if you don't understand how they can happen, and if you knew that, certain things would cost such an enormous amount of energy that wouldn't even be useful at some point. Like, it's like going to Mars. That will change our history forever, for example.
But don't think that once we will get to Mars, we will actually, I don't know, boost our world in a way that will surpass all our problems, and everything will go to this progressive destiny that will lead us who knows where. Like, there are certain simple physical limits here that make us limited, and the beauty of it is that within these limits actually we can do a lot for living a better life, and that unfortunately and disgustingly we don't take that into consideration. We dream too much and applicate mentally too little, and that's a very serious thing. We do need dreamers, because every civilization needs dreamers, but we don't have to become all dreamers. That is possibly one of the most dangerous thing that can happen to a civilization, to be completely detached from hardcore reality, right, as close as we can get to it, right? But by certain standards, it's useless. That this really depends also on the lifestyle we have, and with certain. I just think we are very backwards for our times. Like, I don't see, even you think I'm crazy, but I don't think actually in the last 50 years there have been actual technological improvements, qualitatively speaking. I mean, we're essentially based on the same exact technologies. Yes, we have kind of adapted them to our systems. We have increased communications, whatever. Yeah, huge benefit, etc. But at the same time, concretely, we're always there. Like, there is not so much from the 1970s that at this point is it's wildly different from what we thought it could be now. No, we're essentially the same people, right? We live essentially in that same material world, right? And I don't know why I got here now, but just for thinking that that this all comes from, it started from this, that it all comes from thinking that you can fundamentally just either elude reality or being too tight about the eventual possibilities that you can take into account, right? We need to, paradoxically, to dream of things that can be real. That is, we must make things work on a realistic base, right? So not just saying, okay, let's take every hypothesis and let's make it valid, but not even saying, okay, since you don't have this piece of evidence, it's just an hypothesis, so let's not accept it. Let's exclude it completely, right? Let's pretend it's not true, let's erase it, let's suppress it. This also can't be the case, right? And it's a very difficult balance to maintain. Right? It's not easy, believe me. I think that it's possibly, it's always, the only positive thing about it is that there is always a dialogue, a dialectic, some sort, around this stuff. Like, we seem to be aware, at least, of the fact that things are valid, that there are certain things that are valid to be discussed, that discussion in itself has value. The problem also, we discuss things that tend not to be particularly important. Like, there is an overload of attention to things that are not practically useful. That's the real problem, and that's what von Clausewitz is pointing out. Right? Nobody forces you to be sent to act only on the basis of full certainty, because nobody can. But at least your interest should be to be directed towards a concrete aim, right? A pragmatic attitude to reality, to realize that if something doesn't work in reality, might have been even a good idea, and in the idea itself could serve someone in another field of application, for example, but that still you should be to pay more attention to what the concreteness of reality is, because that doesn't mean that you can't do that. We can't do without reality. What are we applying ourselves for if we are just dreaming about improbable things? That's why I've never liked usually scientific fiction, because I think that science is too important thing to be simply portrayed in strange, imaginative ways that do not fit with reality, right? There is unfortunately a what I don't hesitate to call a and meaning inferior culture developing about this. Okay, let's talk about science without even understanding anything about it, but since it's science, like it's good, right? No, you should, if you want to talk about science, you should know science in some ways, right? And that's the interesting thing. Just posting pictures about planets that of data that you don't even can't even evaluate in its accuracy or in its meaning is a valid thing is a valid approach. Okay, it's like the example we made. You can read 3,000 books in your life but still not understanding a big deal about them. That's a great risk. I could say more about it, but I suspect we are digressing rather too much. But be aware of what von Clausewitz says here. Do not think that just a tiny, as simple as a theory is to be effective, do not think that a theory can base just on a few factors, because few factors normally in reality do not exist. Even in the moment of maximal kind of abstraction for the sake of precision, like in physics, factors are always many and complex, and most of the times we don't understand even what they are. This is the biggest problem. You can imagine in things like history and war. So if you think that you are capable of understanding everything about war because you have such a sixth sense, or you know what it's really about, because I don't know what kind of experience you had, just think twice, because normally a person like von Clausewitz that had a curriculum of some value that you should look up told you that you most likely don't know much what the hell is happening in the first place, right? You can have a better or worse critical skill, but still you will fail many times in assessing what you talk about, right? The essential is to go on with historical inquiry no matter what. That is the real key. It's more like a vocation, a devotion, an orientation than an actual stage, right? Then von Clausewitz goes on, it says, besides this difficulty, critical inquiry also meets with another great and intrinsic one, which is that the progress of events in war seldom proceeds from one simple cause, but from several in common, and that it therefore is not sufficient to follow up a series of events to their origin in a candid and impartial spirit, but that it is then also necessary to apportion to each contributing cause its due weight. This is another massive problem that is what we are saying now, that you can't think that everything proceeds from one or just a set of simple causes, right? And because most of the times we don't know what these causes are in the first place. Guess what, right? So never be too sure about yourself, ever, because most likely you are not, and we, by a certain margin that is usually majority, we are not, right? And we know it. Like this is one of the few certainties that you can spot after all. It's a matter, relatively to what the usefulness of these knowledge is, to the sake of practicality. Then, there are other moral attitudes to this. That's okay. Let's not learn anything because it doesn't serve to anything. Well, okay, yes. So your life will suck compared to the one you could have if you maybe knew a bit more. So yeah, always trying to, and that's a big problem. How do you know which cause was the most important, the least important? What is important when you study the theory of the art of war, we will see it with von Clausewitz himself on another occasion, is effectively the comparison, like the diachronic perspective of warfare. Also in here, you can't pretend to be expert on warfare if you spend your life just about, I don't know, a single army, or a single battle, or even a single war. Like, let's be honest, if you like spent your entire life knowing about, I don't know, just World War II, you've not read about anything else, you're fixated just with one army or another, you most likely, first of all, don't even know World War II that well. Secondly, you don't know much of military history well. Right? This is very interesting because military history should be well learned by studying effectively more or less everything of it in some measure. Like, and that's the most important thing to do. There are many people who do this, who approach warfare for identitary reasons. I do believe it. I've seen it. Right? That the idea is that inherently, especially, let's be honest, because among us males, there is a twisted and sick, but also kind of funny, let's be honest, interest for competition in some form. Like, we like this idea that we come up here and say things and we kind of contest each other, and it's part of our nature. Like, women tendentially are more appeasing. There is a different attitude. Women can be ferociously competitive as well, but usually in other ways, and that actually are much more subtle and intelligent than, on several occasions, than what we do. But there is this idea that if you are usually, military studies are approached by an overwhelming amount of male, if you look even at my statistics in YouTube analytics, I have a 10% of women. That is very interesting, but it's still 10%. Now, why? It's because apparently YouTube is more male dominated. I don't know. It's possible. But I don't think so. I think it's because I talk chiefly about things like bloodbaths and and fights and very, kind of muscular things, But no, really not. I try to keep it actually far from that. I try to shift the problem where it really matters. There's really a matter of intelligence, actually, and that's the thing that counts, right? But aside from that, I see that many people do approach this because they want just to say, okay, I'm the one who is right? That is competitive, and but that's mostly what von Clausewitz would think at a lower level of, like, you can have your reasons and your sense, but that's where you're mostly like person who wants to spend its moral resources and to fight and to be, but maybe doesn't think that much, right? People will think tendentially are less competitive but more successful, and that's the trick. Who wouldn't like to be more successful and less competitive, right? That's what we're looking for here. And that's what exactly von Clausewitz in this regard was. And but it does take definitely less competitive, meaning that you have to compete less, exactly because you come up with something that is so, self-evident in some way that you can't really be contradicted. So von Clausewitz speaks his mind pretty clearly about it, and that's why I defend him always, because I deem every criticism towards von Clausewitz as a misunderstanding of von Clausewitz. Right? That is much easier to do, because intelligent things are difficult to be understood. It takes a lot of time, right? Everybody can understand von Clausewitz. It is fairly simple, like as I often say, but it takes application. If you don't use application, you can even be intelligent, but you will not understand. You will not get it, right? Stupidity is not a matter of not being intelligent in the sense that, but you can be intelligent, but you are not, right? It's a different thing from being an ignorant, for example, right? It's a very different thing. But aside from this, I think this method has a powerful, point of reference for everybody who really wants to address military matters in any way. So instead of going out there, groups being competitive and saying writing idiocies, etc., I promise one day I will make a random tour on the Facebook groups about history that I have, and see all the most stupid things that are posted continuously and rightfully criticized, because fortunately we definitely live even among intelligent people, but they're so funny because you can spot so easily what's wrong with that, right? And it's so didactic. You learn from it. If you've never participated to a Facebook group, I stopped like a couple of years ago, and that's part of the reason why I also began Schwerpunkt right in the first place. It's because I wanted in some way also parade exemplarily the most silly mistakes that sometimes are done, right? You realize here that I'm fairly quiet, but my way of doing things, but I am sometimes sarcastic and polemic, and I don't like that side of me, because it's that still that, non-rational, not disciplined soldier, but more warlike, individualistic side that is not tamed, right? That's part of Ares that has still not been crushed by Athena, and that's how I like to see that, right? But one day we'll have to do it, because it's really worth the shot, and there are so many ridiculous things that really, however, give you a deep anthropological insights of the mistakes that we make. Usually, I mentioned those Facebook groups because they are about things like politics, war, society, right? So all the things that we discuss here, and we will exemplify better what we're talking about. So what can we talk now about? Where were we? Okay, yes, we were talking about the assessing the weight of all the various causes, right? And I was starting to talk about why it's needed to have a comparative and diachronic view of military history as a whole, because without that, you can't effectively have a measure to value the weight of the various causes, right? Because if you've seen something happening over and over again, and you kind of developed this sensitivity to it, that you can spot where this was about to happen or not, and why, you can actually have a dimensional intuition of what that thing might have been about, even if you don't have the exact quantity of it. And that's of cognitive process that von Clausewitz assigns a great importance to, right? Intuition is a lot here, because it happens incredibly well in our brain, right? We are obsessed with rationality, but what happens here, even through intuition, is something that no computer has the capacity to calculate, right? Intuition is not like an abstract idea to say, okay, let's justify something just on the base of guts, right? Feeling. No, it comes from experience. So it's still explicable rationally, but it's something that if you haven't experienced, you can't directly assess, right? So that paradoxically helps you to be less radical and dogmatic than others, because others will say to you exactly, where's the evidence? And you'll say, well, consider these aspects. If you don't meet with someone that gets essentially the shade that you're trying to highlight, because that could be effectively the evidence of a certain reality, well, there's no dialogue, because that person doesn't quite know what you're talking about and is saying it's either black or white, and there's no middle ground. And instead, there's always a middle ground. This is what von Clausewitz is telling us, that there's never full certainty, right? There is always a minimal side, even that has to be taken into account, even if it seems to be irrelevant, right? Even to give its right place, but still it's a set of very complicated calculations and perceptions at the same time that can't be fully explained. Like, we don't have a language, a calculation system that can express human intuition, right? And we know that we're fairly accurate in this regard, that even mechanically we do respond exactly like this, right? The example of, having an experience like you start driving for the first time, someone, passes in front of you suddenly, and you immediately, maybe the first time you will not hit the brake because you're not prepared, but subconsciously next time your brain has learned that, even if you haven't rationalized it, and you will hit the brake. This is how we work, and that's amazing. Like, no machine in the world is able to do anything like that. We don't even know how it works. That's the interesting thing. And about the brain, we have understood very, 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 very few so far. But still, it works in the way it should, right? It's not, it also fails sometimes, but that's mostly not about this mechanism. It's really more about what we think we're doing with our reason that puts us in trouble, right? Even if, of course, it also gives an extra, speed in some ways that should be pursued, but on a also being backed, it's as if reason floated in this sea of feelings. How we are, like, that's a pretty accurate psychological section of human beings. So what we were saying here is proportionate. Okay. Okay, and then for Clausewitz, talking always about the causes, says this leads therefore to a closer investigation of their nature, and thus a critical investigation may lead into what is the proper field of theory. Right. So that you can always explore more these causes. And then he writes, the critical consideration, that is, the testing of the means, leads to the question, which are the effects peculiar to the means applied, and whether these effects were comprehended in the plans of the person directing, right? This is very important, especially relatively to the third step, because here the judgment really must be used, and that's what justifies effectively judging someone, right? The judgment today seems to be very stigmatized, like, you can't judge me because I only know. Well, no, as a matter of fact, everybody can judge anyone, right? The problem is how correctly we do that, and how much this person is able to understand the judgment and evaluate whether it's, what needs to be done with it. With war is a very complicated deal, because also in here we most of the times we don't even know whether the story we are presented with is actually correct. Like, I met this problem especially in the when I wrote my master thesis. That I addressed it on another occasions, that basically there was a strategic move that renowningly among the scholars is not understood. Right? Why did a commander at one point moved an army towards one point to meet the enemy in battle that he eventually won? So we have to realize that even in here the means naturally of our understanding, because at that point it was basically getting into the mind of a medieval king of the 13th century, which is pretty difficult to do with all the knowledge of the politics of society, of this space where it was, the whole thing was taking place, that we evidently cannot know. But do we know, right? Always remember, in here, the most quoted Clausewitzian phrase, that war is nothing but the prosecution of politics by other means. So it's obvious that always, aside from an abstract military logic, we have to try to understand why someone would do something. Right, we're talking about in terms of resources, of political pushes, of external factors that maybe we're not aware of, historically speaking. That we are not actually most of the times, right? Sometimes it's clearer, but sometimes it's really not. And this is paradoxically true. Perhaps more for larger events, right? There are certain, especially in those contexts when one individual choice has more influence on the wall, right? It becomes more difficult there to investigate, because reality draws immediately attention towards the the guy who took that decision, that, as we have seen also in von Clausewitz, is actually the person that from the top of that position has the greatest trouble in assessing things, and therefore at that point is trying to be in someone else's mind that normally you can't do. Telepathy does not exist. People living today, you can imagine someone who lived 700 years ago. So the idea is that you have to consider naturally the means at disposal of this person, and that becomes very fascinating, especially in strategy, and yet more difficult, right? And of course we should try to put ourselves in that person's shoes. It's not easy, it's impossible, it's sometimes too pretentious and arrogant, and you feel bad when you do it, because you realize, what the hell can I know? But at the same time, you must try to simulate in a way or another what this thing could be like, and try to come up with an answer, right? And it's not that you are necessarily like, if I had to explain that specifically, maybe we will do it. Maybe I have my ideas about it, but in that case they're truly just hypotheses, because effectively we don't have any evidence to support that. Right, even if we were to consider the thing applying this broadly military logic that comes from the study of history, right, of military history, that's not prudent to do, but still that's what we should do. And when we do it, it's obvious that we do it for expressing a judgment, like, was this person doing well, right? I must confess that when I talk about history, I generally speaking think that we are, and I say it openly many times, that we are not more competent or capable or even intelligent regarding those situations than the people who lived in them. Sometimes I wondered, like, but are you sure that maybe these people weren't doing mistakes like we still do today, right? Because it's as if we were judging certain politicians from, 700 years from now and saying, okay, well, this person made a stupid thing, but hey, what the hell do we know after all? Yeah, I feel that interpretation. Like, I realize that objectively the human mistake factor is always there. These people might have done something stupid every once in a while, but at the same time, it's still an hypothesis. Like, if you don't know why that thing happened, also, why should you judge it so much, right? You can see that, for example, that there might have been a misassessment, but I mean, now that I think of those situations in the 13th century, also, why? How do you think we really know fully about this? It's like, even this usually happens even with these great battles, right? Imagine, I don't know, if Pompey, that's the example I used to do most of the times, had won at Pharsalus. Like, there is a substantial debate about. There are people who think that Pompey was just megalomaniac, kind of incapable, person that had achieved a great much just because he was favored by either. He was a favorite of Sulla originally, and then he had it easier in strategical context that had already been solved largely by others. Think about Lucullus, and then other people think that he was actually a great general, that he deserved the appellative of Magnus, right, and so on. And then just imagine if at Pharsalus he had won. He had counter-tricked Caesar's cavalry on the, if I remember correctly, left flank. So we would have had, first of all, a wholly different history. Secondly, we would think now Pompey was one of the greatest commanders of the ancient world ever. Now, you would say, well, okay, but Pharsalus was still won by Caesar, so that's what makes the difference. That is true as well. But at the same time, our judgment about the man, historically speaking, is like based on such a tiny amount of evidence, written even later, or also, generally speaking, through a certain lens, through exposed to so many things that naturally had influence even the judgment at the time, is that what the hell do we know? We are repeating as parrots essentially just what we find in the sources, but what the hell do we know where this was actually true or not? And the people who get more dogmatic about it are in fact the ones who have never posed themselves this problem. Like, what the hell do we know? Or worse is even when there is a scholar writes one concept, everybody falls in love with it, and they repeat it, and they say, but it's that scholar that wrote it. But maybe that scholar was wrong. Right? It is like people that think that Polybius, for example, was such an expert person in military matters. We actually don't have any evidence of that. About the famous clash between the Roman Manipular Legion and the Macedonian Hellenistic phalanx. Like, we think he's the ultimate authority who says point blank, the things were in this way because of this few reasons, right? We know how war is complicated. You can't reduce it to those few reasons. Polybius was a genius, was one of the best threads you can ever take. It seems to talk with a person of our days, objectively. But he was also writing in a context that, in fact, he was very appreciated in the 19th century during positivism, because he had this positivistic attitude, like this idea of making sense, which is typically an Hellenic thing. To make always giving a rationalizing explanation, even if maybe reality was more complicated, right? And therefore, everybody copies and repeats that. But this happens in other many fields. Always, I don't know why now I have such many parallelisms with examples with the ancient world, but it was Connolly who mistranslated from the Lub translator the Greek word longket. It was the heavy javelin used by the Phoenicians in that context, but also by other troops, Marines in the Ptolemaic Navy, or something like that, as sarissa. Like, basically transformed a heavy javelin into a Macedonian pike. Hence, after this guy, if you look on the internet, it's plenty of pictures of artworks that depict the Carthaginians having used effectively the Macedonian phalanx as a model of army, where we have, it was not true. Like, we have absolutely not even the slightest evidence that this was even any close to real. And we know actually that Carthaginians fought in a very precise and different way than that, and that there are also many reasons that I opened this Pandora's box that is dangerous now. But I promise I will talk about it somewhat soon. But for example, everybody followed that. Why? Because Connolly wrote it, and therefore, if Connolly wrote it, it means that your brain shuts down. You can't even translate or even contextualize that term. And why did Connolly get it wrong? Because he got it from a translator that mistranslated a term. And why did the translator mistranslate a term? Because he was lazy, or didn't know well ancient Greek, or didn't know the sources, or he was not a military historian, so he was just a philologist, didn't understand anything about military logic, or even what the term context was in the first place. So here we have half of the people believing the Carthaginians used the Macedonian phalanx. This is literally how it happened, right? And the problem is, this is think about all the resources that we need to eradicate this mistake, and what for something that now we can trace back, but because it happened recently. But what about the ancient world? We have just those 3-4 sources. What if some got wrong and was a wholly different history we don't know about? And we have to surrender to reality here, that most of history, what you think you read in history book, is largely inaccurate, right? And not that now you can revise history and invent it at your will, because if you don't have any evidence yourself and you go against evidence, you're an idiot, right? So there is a trustable history, but always realizing it's a product of an approximation, that you should always be very careful how to handle it. Okay, so yes, we had read this, and then the last phrase is the effects peculiar to the means lead to the investigation of their nature, and thus again into the field of theory. So basically, theory gets fueled also by the fact that, okay, we have judged the general for a single, use of its military. We're talking about the military instrument here. The theory of the art of war deals with the armed forces already set up in some way. Naturally, of course, here it's important to distinguish. We're talking about the theory of the art of war, which means that, of course, we exclude politics and society, but not in the sense that we do it theoretically. But obviously, when we investigate historically, we have to take that into account. It's just in fact, a subject distinction, but not because that is not important, right? And this judgment over the person there kind of brings us more to look at the person that even we can't inquire at such a great distance of time, most of the times, and because we're not in this person's head, is to look at the means at disposal. Like, that makes more sense, right? Is at least, let's see what was even making reflection what was potentially possible to do with those means. And this brings us back straight to what theory is concerned with, because theory is exactly about that. What should do with your means when you're in a certain situation. So you see here that there is a circle that closes itself, and this was part 1, and this chapter is fairly long. Yeah, definitely long. Oh my god, too long. We will get to the half of it. Okay, yeah. There are lots of pages, so we will be stuck here for a long time, but anyhow, the important is that we progress, and I'm glad also because in every video we also discuss more things at once, right? Alright, so for now we stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.